Hello everyone, and I'm here at the Johnson Family Cemetery in Stonewall, Texas for the burial site of the 36th President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. Sorry, my voice is kind of shot right now. We just did a bowl game for my college band in Frisco, Texas. So we're down here visiting Lyndon Johnson's gravesite in Gillespie. We're in Gillespie County, Texas on Lyndon Johnson's ranch. So this is really neat. He's buried right over here. We actually can't go inside the cemetery, unfortunately, because it's still owned by the family as a private cemetery. And around here is buried in between all these oak trees. And they stay green year round. It was his request to be buried underneath him to kind of symbolize the landscape that he loved here on the ranches in the hill country of Texas, which is where we are. Really unique area. It's pretty cool. It's kind of between Austin and San Antonio in Texas. So it's pretty cool. He's buried here along with his wife Lady Bird, bunch of other family members of his. Right back there is his birthplace. He was born here on August 27th of 1908. His father was served in the Texas state legislature, and when Johnson was a young child, he often traveled with his father throughout the 10th district of Texas around the hill country and campaigned, and that's where Johnson got a love of politics from there. His old school was actually over there where he went to primary school, which is really interesting. So Johnson ended up graduating from Johnson City High School, which is in Gillespie County, in 1924. He was voted in as his class president during his high school career, and after that he went to college and was involved in the college politics there, and eventually actually became a teacher for a little bit. He taught 5th, 6th, and 7th grade at a Mexican-American school. He taught public speaking for a year, and eventually became an advisor, an assistant to some congressmen up in Washington, D.C., and ended up over there in the early 1930s. In 1934, he married his wife, Lady Bird Johnson, who was one of the most famous first ladies for her dealings with environmental stuff and things like that, so she's very influential. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt, at the time, appointed him as the director of the Texas branch of the NYA, which is the National Youth Administration. And so he directed that for 2 years until his congressman, representative in Congress, James Buchanan, died. No, not that James Buchanan. James P. Buchanan, different James Buchanan. He passed away in January of 1937, and Johnson ended up winning that election and became a congressman for the House of Representatives. That's where he got his nickname that he would later be called Landslide Lyndon, because he won a lot of elections in a landslide. Wasn't even close. And so that's what happened there. And so he served and ran on a New Deal platform, supporting Roosevelt's New Deal. This was during the Depression and everything like that was going on. He was just 28 when he became a member of the House. Later down the line, when Pearl Harbor was bombed, Lyndon Johnson actually joined the military and fought in World War II after being in Congress, which was a lot of congressmen actually did that. A lot of people don't realize that, which is very interesting. Eventually, though, Johnson ended up being elected to the Senate in 1949. He served in the House for 12 years and in the Senate for another 12. Eventually, in the Senate, he became very influential and rose to prominence. He was a staunch advocator for education, civil rights, improving poverty, and things like that. He helped a lot of bills get through Congress, and he was a political mastermind. He actually eventually became the Senate Majority Leader, which is probably, arguably, besides the president, the most powerful position anybody could be in the United States government. He was also a huge advocate for the space race at the time as well, and he later, while he was vice president, became the chairman of the Space Council, against the Soviet Union. He became very enthralled after Sputnik 1 was launched in the 1950s. And although he was not a Republican, he still supported Eisenhower on most of his things in the 1950s. And he actually sought the presidency in 1960 and actually was in the running. But he lost to John F. Kennedy in the Democratic nomination in 1960. He did not expect Kennedy to win in the landslide that he did in the convention. And he expected there to be more ballots, and he thought that he would eventually, if he didn't get it the first time, would eventually get it. However, the next morning, Kennedy called Johnson and asked him to be his running mate. John F. Kennedy at the time was very popular. He was young. Everybody loved him. And he wanted more support in the South because Kennedy was from Massachusetts. So he picked Johnson, even though Kennedy, I don't know if he really thought Johnson was the most because a lot of times some presidents want to pick people that'll be on their side on every issue. Well, Kennedy picked Johnson mostly so he could win in the South, which actually helped him out a lot in the election because the 1960 election was very close. They beat Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge barely in one of the closest elections in U.S. history in 1960. And Johnson was elected vice president. And Johnson was indifferent on the office of vice presidency. He went from being Senate Majority Leader to the leader in the Senate to the vice president, which the vice president's the president of the Senate, but they don't have any power whatsoever. And Johnson actually tried to pass legislation to give himself more power as the vice president, and to actually give the vice president the duties of the Senate Majority Leader. But he was unsuccessful, and that was very unpopular. And his former colleague in Texas, vice president under Roosevelt, John Nance Garner, said, the vice presidency isn't worth a bucket of warm piss. That was his most famous quote, John Nance Garner. And Johnson definitely agreed with that. However, Kennedy did allow Johnson to become the chairman of the Space Council during his vice presidency, Johnson's vice presidency, and was more successful than most vice presidents. And some people argue that Johnson was the most successful vice president in American history. I've heard that argued before. And he predicted that with the way that NASA was going, that we could make it to the moon before 1970, which he was correct. And John F. Kennedy famously said in 1961 that we will enter the moon and get to the moon by the end of the decade. And during Johnson's presidency, Apollo 8 was the first mission to actually orbit the moon. And so Johnson put us on top in the space race against the Soviet Union, put the United States on top. So, as I'm sure a lot of you know about this already, on November 22nd, 1963, tragically, President John F. Kennedy was killed, and he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, actually just about 4-hour drive from this ranch here in Stonewall. Kennedy was assassinated, and therefore immediately following his death, Johnson was proclaimed as the president of the United States, and so he became president, not originally in his own right. He succeeded the presidency after Kennedy's assassination. Johnson worked hard at helping the nation. The United States was completely distraught and just in mourning after Kennedy's assassination, and Johnson made sure that he respected and got through all the things Kennedy had been working on. One of the biggest was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was the first major civil rights legislation passed since Reconstruction. So it was a huge deal. It was the first step to ending segregation in the South. So that was a huge deal. And he made sure that he honored Kennedy's traditions of the office and fulfilled what Kennedy would have wanted. That was his big goal for his first term. Johnson also invented what he called the Great Society, is what he envisioned his presidency. That was the plan. He called it the Great Society. He wanted to improve things like poverty, education, environmental assistance. And he also created an amendment to establish Medicare and Medicaid to the Social Security Act that Franklin Roosevelt had originally passed. Johnson is responsible for the creation of Medicare and Medicaid, which has helped so many people in this country. And so that is a huge thing he did during his presidency. Like I said, he was also the first president to be on top in the space race, overseeing Apollo 8's mission to the moon. They didn't land on the moon, but they were the first ones there to orbit. Johnson also famously passed the Civil Rights Act in 1968, which was seen by most people as his biggest accomplishment. This ultimately ended segregation in the South, which had been a huge issue. The same year that Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were killed, which Robert Kennedy was the Attorney General in his first term during that campaign. But the biggest downfall for Johnson, and what made him very unpopular at the end, he eventually ran for re-election in 1964, won a term in his own right against Barry Goldwater, just completely destroyed him, one of the biggest landslides in presidential history. The biggest downfall to his presidency that historians look back on was the Vietnam War and his dealings with the Vietnam War. Domestically, Johnson was one of the most successful presidents. Abroad, it's a little more debated. Johnson is famous for having sent troops to Vietnam in 1965. After the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin incident, Johnson passed to basically allow him to send troops to Vietnam without a declaration of war. And so the Vietnam War was never officially declared. And so he sent troops over there in 1965, and eventually, over the next few years, it became a war of attrition. And a lot of people at home were not a fan of the Vietnam War at all. It was very unpopular. There were riots across the country and everything like that. And Johnson decided not to run for another term in 1968. Although he could have, he decided not to. And is actually the last president to step down until Joe Biden in 2024. He could have served 10 years as president, but he decided not to run due to his unpopularity, and he didn't feel like running again. And so his dealings with the Vietnam War and things like that led to him leaving office rather unpopular, unfortunate to him. So that's the Johnson's presidency in a nutshell. He eventually retired to his ranch here in 1969 when he left office, and he actually ended up dying here less than 4 years later on January 22nd of 1973. Actually, just 2 days after he would have left office had he won another term, which is very interesting. He would have had the shortest retirements of any president of 2 days he would have had. And one more fun fact about his death. Just about less than a month prior, on December 26th of 1972, President Harry Truman passed away. And so the flags in the United States were left at half-staff for Truman's death, and they're supposed to be held at half-staff for about 30 days. But Johnson died less than 30 days after Truman, and so the flag was left at half-staff for another month. And so that, in the American history for presidents, that is the longest the flag has been at half-staff, was because Johnson and Truman died so close to each other. So that's another fun fact. So that's Lyndon Johnson, his presidency. And we're going to be screaming his name for Smash as well, so let's go ahead and do that.
Lyndon B. Johnson for Smash!
We're going to give you a little view of his birthplace now that we're here, because it's kind of on the same grounds, and I thought it was interesting. So he was born here in 1908. He was the first child of Sam Ely Johnson Jr., who was a state legislator, and Rebecca Baines Johnson. She was an educator and journalist. He lived here for the first 5 years of his life. And then in 1964, him and his wife, Lady Bird, reconstructed the building. Lady Bird's buried over there. She actually died in 2007. She was like 95 when she died. She lived a long time. She lived almost 34 years after Johnson did, which is crazy. I was actually alive when she died. It was interesting.
Been here since Lyndon resided.
All right, guys, it's going to conclude the Lyndon Johnson presidential tour of his ranch here in Stonewall, Texas. So be sure to comment, like, and subscribe. And thank you guys so much for watching. Smash the like button for me. And I'll see you guys next time. If you're interested in any more presidential grave sites, we got them on the channel. We'll see you guys next time. Goodbye. Wah!